Since the creation of the mortal plane in the Dawn era, men and Mer alike have always pondered the heavens and the relationship between themselves and the divine. How does the humble ephemerality of our lives factor into the grand scheme of existence itself? How can mortals show reverence to their godly creators and benefactors? The people of Tamriel have many such answers to these questions. Most pantheons of Tamrielic religion worship some or all Aedric gods in one form or another. Many other cults alternatively revere the Daedric gods, often viewed as the rivals of the Aedra. In the Cyrodiilic heartland, where imperial influence is strongest, you'll rarely find someone who does not follow this framework. However, as one gets further from the authority of the Ruby Throne, you'll find the matter of gods and worship can be quite different from the interpretation of cult priests from the Imperial City. In the far-off eastern lands of Morrowind, the Imperial cult plays second lute to the Dunmer native religion, the worship of Almsivi, the Tribunal Temple. The history and workings of the Tribunal Temple are worth telling in detail. What are the origins of the faith? How is it organized? What is its belief system? Does it factor into provincial politics? How long is one able to go without paying imperial taxes before they send someone after you? There are a great many questions that deserve answers. If you find yourself enjoying the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the video in the algorithm and shows your appreciation for my work. If you'd like to support me even more, check out my Patreon, where you can vote on upcoming video topics. This video was voted for by my very good-looking patrons. And finally, check out Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel. These mod projects have done a great job in expanding the world building of Elder Scrolls, and much of my work is based on their content. To understand the institution of the Tribunal Temple and its beliefs, one must first understand its history. How did the Tribunal of Vivec, Sothasil, and Almalexia become the living gods revered by the Dunmer of Morrowind? Of course, the Dunmer were not always the gravelly-voiced, red-eyed dark elves we know them as today. The Dunmer, like all elves, trace their lineage to the Aldmer, the precursor race of elves that migrated to the Somerset Isles from the likely mythical continent of Aldmeris. Throughout many centuries of the Merethic era, High Elf culture thrived, with elven civilization spreading beyond the Somerset Isles and to mainland Tamriel. However, many elves of this early Aldmeri civilization began to view their society as increasingly decadent and degenerate. For many, a change was needed. An Aldmer, who would eventually become revered as Saint Veloth, rose as the leading figure of this rising populist movement. In the face of a society that seemed to reward the devious, wealthy, and selfish, Veloth would preach the values of charity, modesty, and preservation of tradition. Veloth and his followers viewed the worship of the Aedra as one of the key reasons Aldmeris had succumbed to the lowest vices. As an alternative, the Velothi instead followed the traditional worship of ancestors and worship of the so-called good Daedra, Azira, Mephala, and Boethia. In addition to this, Veloth instructed his followers how to properly interact with the bad Daedra, to the Velothi known as the House of Troubles. Among religious scholars, it is not known how Veloth came to this view. Had this been a deception by the Daedra to undermine the Aedra, or was this a legitimate attempt by the good Daedra to purify the mortal races and help them along the paths to becoming living saints and achieving Kim? Kim, or as some Outlanders tend to pronounce it, Chim, is a sort of transcendence to an uplifted existence or state of mind. It's a fairly enigmatic concept. It's not necessarily about becoming the kindest, most saintly person, but instead reaching an ultimate truth in understanding of the universe. Kim is something that has been achieved by both the good and bad Daedra, potentially being the enabling factor in their godhood. Most of what we know about the concept of Kim comes from the writings of the living god Vivek. However, his teaching is not without contest, as we will come to know later. The Velothi, with this great religious awakening, would eventually be viewed as schismatic by the religious authorities of the Aldmer, forcing Veloth and his followers to venture to the Tamrielic mainland to find a new home to practice their religious beliefs freely. This exodus would be frightful and arduous, but Veloth had seen a vision of the Promised Land, the land of Resdain, known to us now as Morrowind. The elves that settled this new territory would be known as the Chimer. The timeline of this mass pilgrimage is tricky, but we understand it to have taken place in the core Middle or Late Middle Merethic era, contemporary to or shortly after the dominance of the Aliens over Cyrodiil. Now, I just threw quite a bit of Elvish history at you, and I'm going to force feed you even more before I can begin to get into things like the organizational or political side of the Tribunal Temple. Not that I mind going over all this, but it's important to have these little mental breaks every now and again. I've been warned by an orc apothecary that too many bargain fortify fatigue potions isn't good for my vapors, and will cause some sort of crash out, a sight commonly seen in young mages. I love learning a lesson the easy way. I'm afraid I won't be able to finish my research on the origins of the Tribunal here in Morrowind. While I've no interest in offending the Dunmer with perceived heresy, let's just say some interpretations of events like the Battle of Red Mountain are not something you want to wantonly investigate, unless you wanted to be thrown into a Kagudi pit, that is. It's best I head back to Cyrodiil for a bit, as to not incur an Ordinator no-knock raid. When the Chimer settled in their new holy realm of Resdain, it of course was not an unpopulated land. Living throughout Old Morrowind were Nordic and Dwemer peoples. In these early days, the Chimer were mostly nomadic, and confrontations between the other races were minor. However, the Chimer would eventually settle into a sedentary civilization dominated by the great houses we know today. In the west, along the borders of Skyrim, would be the domain of House Redoran. In the southwest, House Lalu. The central east, House Indoril. The northeast, House Telvanni. The deep southeast, House Dress. And on the island of Vardenfell, House Dagoth. With the establishment of an early nobility and settling down of the people, the Chimer adopted a feudal-like system, seen in many parts of Tamriel, like Cyrodiil, High Rock, and Skyrim. But of course, as mentioned before, the Chimer are not the sole occupants of these lands. While on the northern periphery there existed Nord settlements, the principal competition to the Chimer would be the Dwemer, a race of Mer that settled Morrowind and other areas of Tamriel before recorded Elven history. There is a common misconception that the Dwemer are atheistic, denying the existence of any gods. However, it is more accurate to say they are agnostic to the divinity of what others perceive as gods. The interventions of the Aedra and Daedra are undeniable. However, the Dwemer would consider the gods of others to not be gods, but instead powerful beings that could be contended with. Where one might be rewarded with special protections from service to a Daedra, the Dwemer would strive to achieve the same result via logic and empiricism. This would often take the form of a mechanical contraption, or more curiously, an example of tonal architecture. From what Imperial scholars understand, tonal architecture is the manipulation of sound mixed with the use of magicka to enforce one's will on reality, as a god does. How this works, or even if it worked at all, is not completely understood by us today. The squabbles of the Khmer and Dwemer would come to an abrupt cessation with the invasion and near total conquest of Morrowind by the First Nordic Empire around the year 240 of the First Era. The only part of Morrowind that would remain unoccupied by the Nords would be a Dwemer redoubt on Vardenfell. A minor note regarding this conquest: many Dwemer populations on Morrowind's mainland would fall under Nordic rule, and likewise, Khmer populations on Vardenfell existed outside of Nordic rule. The period of Nordic hegemony over Morrowind would persist for about 200 years until the formation of the First Council. A Khmer known as Induril Nerevar would unite the Great Houses as their hortator and make an alliance with their former Dwemer rivals to unite against the Nordic yoke. Nordic rule had sharply waned due to a destructive civil war within their empire, when no clear successor came after the death of High King Borgus. With the expulsion of the Nords by the First Council, roughly 2.5 centuries of peace and cooperation between the Khmer and Dwemer existed in Morrowind, due in large part to the personal friendship of Induril Nerevar and the Dwemer king Dumak. However, this peaceful coexistence would not last. Attempts were made on both sides to undermine the alliance. Nerevar's wife Amalexia, along with his 2 closest advisors, Sothasil and Vivek, pulling one way, and Dumak's chief tonal architect, Kagranak, pulling the other. In the year 668 of the First Era, Lord Vorin of House Dagoth discovered the Numidium project, Dwemer plans to build a living god. Nerevar consulted Azura on the matter, who confirmed this, an unacceptable sacrilege to students of Veloth's teachings. Nerevar would soon consult Dumak, who completely resented Khmer concerns over the project. Scorned by his former comrade, Nerevar rallied a coalition of Khmer to destroy the profane mechanism that was the Numidium before it could be completed. Dumak in turn rallied his warriors to confront this assault. On Vardenfell, under the shadow of the Red Mountain, the forces of these former friends would meet for a decisive battle. Before we get into the details of the drama that is the War of the First Council and Battle of Red Mountain, I feel I must do my scholarly duty with a few disclaimers we need to keep in mind going forward. While the First Era 668 is generally accepted as the year this occurred, it may have happened later. Some scholars put the date at First Era 700. But that isn't too important. What is important is the conflicting accounts of the battle. Thus far, I've more or less given you the imperial version of this history, which is about as impartial as one can get, considering the Empire at this time has no presence or skin in the game. Until recently, we've had to mostly rely on Dunmer histories of this event, which can be hard to distinguish between fact and mythology. I did say it would be safer to talk about this outside Morrowind. I won't reveal my sources, but let's just say, I still have some connections in Cyrodiil that keyed me in on a newfound imperial interest in the life of Induril Nerevar. What that means exactly, I don't know. Maybe they're driven by curiosity, like me. Well, I'm also driven by the need to pay off a gambling debt, but don't worry about that. And lastly, before I continue the narrative, what is Numidium exactly? Talos heads, you know what I'm talking about. Numidium was a Dwemer-built mechanical colossus powered by the Heart of Lorkhan, which in theory could be controlled by mortals. We aren't sure exactly what the Heart of Lorkhan is or was, but scholars and theologians all over Tamriel have mostly settled on it literally being the heart of the trickster god Lorkhan. Lorkhan either deceived or convinced the Aedra to create Mundus, the mortal realm in which we exist. Lorkhan's heart was placed in the depths of Red Mountain, perhaps willingly or as punishment by the other gods. The Dwemer would have discovered the heart at some point in the First Era and also discovered its divine nature. Chief tonal architect of the Dwemer, Lord Kagernak, likely developed some method to harness the power of the heart and imbue mundane objects with divinity. Kagernak then set on creating a divine automaton using the power of the heart. We don't know if King Dumak was fully aware of this plan, but either way, his dismissal of Nerevar's concern over Numidium led to war between the Chimer and Dwemer. Another key aspect here is Shor is the Nord name of Lorkhan. The Nords believe Shor is a patron god of man that was unjustly cast down by the elven gods for creating Mundus. Very sensitive and heavy stuff. About the same time Nerevar gathered his army to march on Red Mountain, a Nordic army crossed the Inner Sea from the west to confront this Chimer attack on their god's heart. Were the Nords and Dwemer formerly allied in defense? A question we don't have a concrete answer to. What we do know is the Ash King, a reincarnated Skyrim High King Wulfharth, led a force to oppose Nerevar's Chimer in a sort of co-belligerency with the Dwemer. Tribunal sources say the Nords intervened on behalf of the Dwemer due to a betrayal of Vorin Dagoth, who revealed the existence of the Heart of Shor, baiting Nerevar into a battle of impossible odds, having to fight both a Dwemer and Nord army. The true role of Vorin Dagoth historically is quite messy. There are effectively two narratives, one as a betrayer and one as a loyal friend to Lord Nerevar. Vivek's account of the battle bluntly paints Dagoth as a betrayer, one who made a secret pact with the Dwemer to become the Lord of the Chimer himself upon an 11th hour betrayal of Nerevar. The alternative is Dagoth as a loyal friend. He had warned Nerevar of a dark Dwemer secret, and Azura confirmed his truth. Dagoth never contacted the Nords and instead remained loyal to the end, only to be betrayed himself by Elmsivi, who sought the power of the heart for themselves. Whatever betrayals may or may not have occurred, regardless of how many armies fought on what side, we know this. Lord Nerevar and the Chimer won a decisive victory over the Dwemer and Nords. What happens in the final moments of the affair is what would change the history of Morrowind. I'll try to present this in the most neutral way possible. After speaking with some Ashlanders in my travels, I've heard an alternative side of the story. I will circle back to their telling of the battle later. As best we know, in the final moments of the battle, Kagernak activated Numidium, but was thwarted nonetheless by Nerevar and Almsivi. Again, for the Outlanders in the back, Almsivi is 3 people: Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek. Considering Tiber Septim's later use of Numidium, it was either not destroyed by Almsivi or successfully activated by Kagernak in some way. However, the attempt at activation and interaction with the Heart of Lorkhan caused all Dwemer to suddenly blink out of existence. Another one of Nirn's great mysteries that remains unsolved. In the Chamber of the Heart, the Dwemer, now gone, Nerevar and his companions began bickering over what to do with the Heart of Lorkhan. Vorin Dagoth desired to wield Numidium and the divine powers of the heart as Kagernak had planned. But Lord Nerevar, insulted by this profane suggestion, went to strike down Dagoth. The duel would leave Dagoth defeated, but Nerevar would sustain mortal wounds in return. The guardianship of the Chimer and the secrets of the battle would fall to Almsivi. In the books of the Hieroglypha, the accepted writings and teachings of the Tribunal Temple, there is no mention of the Heart of Lorkhan, or the method in which Kagrenac used to wield its power. Instead, Almsivi used their preordained divine power to destroy the Dwemer and bring victory in the battle. The memory of Lord Dagoth and his house would henceforth be damned as a traitor house. The demon forever known as Sharmat, scorned by Almsivi and generations of their disciples. Shortly after, or towards the end of the battle, Red Mountain erupted violently, coinciding with the transformation of the Chimer, who up to this point looked like all other Aldmeri elves, into the dark-skinned, red-eyed Dunmer we see them as today. The temple teaches the Dunmer that their complexion is not a curse, but a badge of divine honor, in the light of the ascent of the tribunal to godhood. Some Imperial and Altmer priests say this change is actually a curse by Azura, a punishment for the blasphemous worship of the tribunal for self-declaring as gods, a hubris that would not go unnoticed. However you see it, Almsivi established themselves as the de facto rulers of Morrowind, their tribunal becoming the subject of the Dunmer religion. The tribunal, using their divine powers, would seal off a perimeter around Red Mountain with a barrier called the Ghost Fence, keeping the people outside of it safe, or perhaps in some cases, keeping prying eyes from going in. Who really knows? Following the victory of Almsivi at Red Mountain, the writings, rules, and traditions of the new Dunmer religion began to take shape. The old Chimeri ways of ancestor and limited Daedra worship rapidly evolving into the Tribunal Temple seen today. The settled Dunmer of the Great Houses acknowledged the Tribunal as anticipations of the three good Daedra, the divine precursor ancestral spirits of the now living tribunes, Vivek, Sothasil, and Almalexia. The beliefs and tenets would be put to paper in a collection of books and priestly writings known as the Hieroglypha. The Hieroglypha covers a variety of religious topics, such as moral lessons for temple adherents, official narratives on temple history, compendiums of saints, doctrinal beliefs, commentaries on doctrinal beliefs, and much more. The Hieroglypha is an ever-evolving anthology, with many writings being added or appended well within living memory. One example of this comes from The Lives of the Saints, a book which teaches the lives and lessons of many prominent Dunmer saints. A lesson of race and cultural pride is taught via the life of Saint Roris the Martyr, a Dunmer from the lands of House Dress, who, when captured by revolting Argonian slaves, would not renounce his faith in the tribunal. Being tortured to death, his perceived martyrdom inspired the Dunmer to declare a vengeful war on the Argonians of Blackmarsh, resulting in an expansion of Morrowind's borders southwards. This conflict, known as the Arnesian War, took place in the year 396 of the Third Era, contemporary to many other wars of the Imperial Simulacrum. The more famous books of the Hieroglypha are works written by the Tribunal themselves. The 36 Lessons of Vivek, the Homilies of Blessed Almalexia, etc. But many books also have no known authors, written by those with identities lost to time, oral traditions transcribed long after their original conception. Books could also be written by those that sought no recognition or glory for their piety. Some believe many works could have also been anonymously written by the tribunal deliberately. Many books are also written by prominent priests, as singular authors or collaboratively. Sarjoni's Sermons is a collection of Vivek's most important sermons with explanations, annotations, and commentary on their meaning as it regards to layman worshippers. Archcanon Tholer Sarjoni serves as a temple patriarch and chancellor to Lord Vivek himself. We'll get into what a title like that actually means later. Sarjoni's Sermons is one of the most widely circulated and referenced texts in all of Morrowind, common not just on temple bookshelves, but in many homes of lower and upper-class Dunmer alike. As the hieroglypha is ever-evolving, sometimes it is hard even for temple disciples to definitively identify what books and writings are even considered part of this collection. There could be texts which may yet become important future additions to the hieroglypha, or more commonly, widespread temple writings incorrectly considered hieroglypha due to their popularity and religious nature. One writing such as this is The Pilgrim's Path, a book regarding a number of pilgrimages to some of Morrowind's shrines. While the book does cover the holy significance and worship instructions of these shrines, it is foremost a literal guide to these shrines, as in their location and appropriate offerings. Although not encompassing every shrine, the book has many redundant details on the lives of saints and tribunes which are covered in core books of the hieroglypha. At least, I don't think Pilgrim's Path is hieroglyphical. Temple priests are sometimes fairly cagey on how important some writings should be, or if laymen should even know about it. I think the Dunmer are fine with a lot of this being confusing. In addition to the hieroglypha is the apocrypha, a collection of writings known only to high-ranking temple priests and ordinators of the Inquisition. It is extremely rare that anyone outside of this privileged few even knows the topics of the apocrypha, let alone even gazed upon the text itself. Some rumors say that anyone given permission to view or contribute to these texts must be sequestered away from the public in secluded monasteries to safeguard the contents even further. I've decided to become an optimist and only indulge in thoughts that inspire joy, so I'd like to think that the Apocrypha, instead of containing the deepest, darkest secrets of the temple that would turn Dunmer society on its head if known publicly, is actually a good faith measure to protect people unprepared to learn certain mythical knowledge. Kind of like an Elder Scroll. The moth priests of the Imperial Library train their whole lives to study the contents, which eventually drives them blind and mad. The bar is closed. This does not inspire joy. My newfound optimistic demeanor will soon be crushed by withdrawals. Now that we've covered the doctrinal texts of the Tribunal Temple, I think it's time to dive into the organization of the institution itself. As you may expect, at the apex of the temple hierarchy are the three tribunes, Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek. But living gods as they may be, much of the administration of the temple is delegated beneath their omnipotence. Of course, Morrowind is governed by the Great Houses, in theory subjects of the Septimian Empire, that have their own cities and offices wherein the actual governance of the population occurs. However, the temple in its own right has its own cities and civil infrastructure to rival that of the Great Houses. Places such as Vivek, Necrom, or Almasthir being some of the largest metropoles in the province. In these cities, you'll find almost everything you would in any of its secular contemporaries. Farmers bringing their goods to market, craftsmen manufacturing finished goods in their shops, architects planning building projects, and taxmer taking a cut of the revenues generated by such activity for the authorities. But in addition to these universal civil operations, temple cities house an extensive number of offices, monasteries, hostels, infirmaries, and military bases as they pertain in particular to the service and sustainment of the temple and its leaders. The city of Necrom itself is one of the holiest sites in the Dunmer religion. According to the legend of Saint Veloth, the site of Necrom is where his journey and exodus of the Chimer finally ended. After his death, Saint Veloth and all those who fell in the exodus were laid to rest here. As a result, the Chimer established a city dedicated to the reverence of the dead. Necrom is truly a place that would deliver the most jarring culture shock to any Outlander. Imperial presence here is minimal to non-existent. The spirits of Dunmer ancestors roam freely in the streets, a city above for the living, and a city below for the dead. Much of the city above is catered to the city below. Many establishments dedicated to funerary, mortuary, and crematory services. Ordinators don gray and black armor with masks made to resemble a state of permanent mourning. It really is a hidden gem for Outlanders to visit. The city is full of museums and art, more than really any other Dunmer city I've seen. I understand the reluctance, though. Presence of an Outlander will lead to increased scrutiny. Violations of Dunmer customs will lead to swift removal. Apparently, you're not even permitted to move faster than a brisk walk. Sad people do tend to not move fast. No lies detected. One of the districts of Necrom is home to the temple offices of the High Fane, one of the most important buildings for temple administration. In the High Fane, you'll find the elves that make the whole operation run. From patriarchs conversing with the gods to humble priests transcribing copies of hieroglyphic texts. At the top of the temple hierarchy, below the tribunal themselves, are the archcanons and patriarchs. Archcanon, in many ways, is not exactly a rank, but more of a position. Archcanons are often also patriarchs themselves, but not exclusively. That being said, they do have authority over temple patriarchs, as their power is derived directly from a tribune. Archcanons have the privilege of conversing directly with the living gods and often serve as their representatives and chancellors. If an archcanon says something, it is to be treated as the words of the gods themselves, as they are the vessels in which they speak. As a result of this, archcanons also have the important task of giving the official orthodox opinions on doctrine and historical narratives. Below the archcanons are the patriarchs. Curiously, even for females, it does seem their official title, if they reach this rank, is formally patriarch, and not matriarch. At least, that's how they titled themselves when I asked. Patriarchs are high-ranking senior clergy that have authority over the priesthood of a large area. You'll find them presiding over temples in major cities, important monasteries, and the most crucial of holy sites. In a similar function to the patriarchs, but on a smaller, less critical scale, are the masters and diviners. These ranks oversee an even smaller subdivision of priests below that of a patriarch, and similarly lead moderately important temples, monasteries, and other religious buildings. By far and away, the rank and file of the temples ordained are the priests. There is not a set level of responsibility a priest may have, duties having quite a wide range. Priests of higher seniority and piety may consecrate ancestral tombs, create bone walkers to protect said tombs, interact with ancestral spirits, guide pilgrims through dangerous areas, confront hostile cults, administer justice to criminals, engage in diplomacy with the great houses, or conduct record-keeping. Someone has to watch over those temple donations. Lower rank priests, well, they could do anything really. Duties like providing basic healing, recanting scripture, handing out alms for the poor, reinforcing moral lessons on laymen, providing basic religious counsel in general. I think you understand. Some of these guys, though, I don't even know what they do around here. I swear they're just professional drunks that just know a few riddles and spells. Actually, that sounds kind of awesome. I take it back. Outside of actual clergy, the temple operates military and monastic orders. The principal military orders of the temple are the 4 orders of the Ordinators. The Order of the Watch is chiefly responsible for the security of temple settlements and enforcement of temple law. Since the armistice, the Ordinators are also required to uphold imperial law. The Order of War fights the external enemies of the temple, bringing the fight to foreign heathens and any demon spawn known to crawl out of places like Red Mountain from time to time. The Order of the Inquisition is focused on the internal enemies of the temple, investigating and rooting out heresy among the Dunmer people living in Morrowind's borders by force of arms. And finally, the order I find the most curious, the Order of Doctrine and Ordination. This is an order of militant scholars trained not only to fight a war of spears, but a war of words. To me, it would seem they're somewhat redundant. I would imagine the Inquisition being the leading arm in combating heresy. But I suppose the Order of Doctrine and Ordination are like a group of law nerds who got jacked so they can back up their words with force. The Ordinators are heavily associated with House Induril and Almalexia, their founder being Saint Olms the Just, the patron saint of the Induril. The Ordinators exemplify his life and teachings, which is detailed in the Lives of the Saints from the Hieroglypha. If you would learn the rule of law and justice, follow Saint Olms the Just, patron of Ashlanders and clerks, founder of the Ordinators. Saint Olms conceived and articulated the fundamental principles of testing, ordeal, and repentance. Outside of the Ordinators are the Buoyant Armigers. They are similar in many ways to the Ordinators. They serve the temple in times of war and combat its enemies with pious arms. However, as the Ordinators are more associated with Induril and Almalexia, the Buoyant Armigers are more aligned to Vivek and House Redoran. The Buoyant Armigers model their lives on that of their lord Vivek, holy adventurers embodying chivalry, self-reliance, and even a bit of whimsicalness. This sort of lifestyle is a magnet for those raised with Redoran values, leading to the perceived association with the Great House. The Armigers serve Vivek specifically in the tasks of defending his relics and the manning of the Ghost Gate, defending the people of Vardenfell from what lies in the ash storms of Red Mountain. These tasks are in part a redundant job with the Ordinators, leading to a bit of light-hearted rivalry between the two groups. However, where Ordinators train in heavy armor and frontline combat, the Buoyant Armigers specialize in speed, mobility, and ambush tactics. Across Morrowind, you'll find many buildings associated with these military orders, with main bases being in temple cities. That now leaves us with temple monasteries, shrines, hostels, and infirmaries. Well, as it happens, I went into great detail about temple hostels and infirmaries in previous writings when I investigated Morrowind's urban poor. If you'd like to know more about that, I'd venture there. However, the monasteries and shrines are temple features I've not yet covered. If I had a septum for every time I've come across a half-naked person on the road, I would have like 5 septums, which isn't a lot, but it's weird it's happened that many times. By nature of their function, temples are typically established in population centers. A priest's chief duties to be the spiritual guides for the lay worshippers of the tribunal. But the temple must also, in many cases, perform alternative religious duties in secluded places where the distractions of society can never impede their worship. Tucked into isolated mountains, sequestered within a remote forest, or perched over a lonely coast are some of the places where you'll find temple monasteries. The monasteries are home almost exclusively to priests and other religious aspirants who dedicate their lives to study and worship of the living gods. More specifically, many parts of these monasteries are focused on the reverence and emulation of a particular saint. North of the Hlalu town of Menan is the monastery of Saint Aurelor. Aurelor lived a life of crime and wickedness, but later sought repentance and forgiveness for his dark path via devotion to the tribunal. As penitence for his sins, he made some of the most important temple pilgrimages on his knees. Dunmer art depicting Saint Aurelor often show him kneeling, with hands high, clasped in a way to signify contrition. The purpose of the monastery of Saint Aurelor reflects his life of repentance. In the words of its head priest Dram Marvos, "Most of our acolytes are former members of the Commonatong. Here they live, work, and meditate to earn forgiveness for the evil things they have done. It is not an easy path to take, nor should it be. Without suffering, there can be no true repentance." West of Flan Oek, at the edge of the Othrelith Woods, you'll find another monastery dedicated, in this case, to the life of Saint Delin the Wise. In his life, Saint Delin was the foremost expert scholar of temple law and a dissertator on Dunmer traditions. Many of his treatises make up a large segment of Morrowind's legal and cultural canon. As such, the monastery of Saint Delin contains an extensive library where acolytes devote their lives to the study of law and culture. It should also be known that while many monasteries follow this model of saintly emulation, there are monasteries without a specific niche or ties to a saint. These monasteries still serve a purpose of being a place where priests may study and worship in seclusion, but based on my observations, have no specific mission. I did notice that these monasteries have a bit of a higher likelihood to contain nobility, so perhaps these establishments are more associated with particular great houses. It's common for sons of nobles far down the line of succession to take to a priestly life. It ensures a bit of political influence and reliability. A Dunmer noble can spend a generous sum of gold in a pious act to construct a monastery, eventually sending relatives there for a religious education. Ideally, these relatives then have the opportunity to move up and get closer to the levers of power controlled by the temple. I'm placing down a lot of conjecture here, but there's zero likelihood the Dunmer great houses aren't attempting to politically influence the temple in soft power ways such as this. The final word I'll give about monasteries is that many of them also provide guardianship over temple shrines. These are likewise associated with the saints or tribunes, so it makes natural sense for monasteries to be built near shrines. As we'll come to know, shrines and the pilgrimages undertaken to reach them are eminently important to the Dunmer faith. For any individual seeking to show his or her devotion to the living gods, the first step will be to make pilgrimages to a number of temple shrines. The shrines are dedicated to particular events relating to the lives of the saints or one of the tribunal gods. Most shrines are similar in appearance to those found within a typical temple. A small obelisk with a fabric tapestry of the holy person the shrine is associated with. However, some shrines can be grander in appearance. The shrine of Almalexia's Fury in the city of Balfoyen takes the form of a large mural embedded in the cliffs below the Andas estate. It is here that Almalexia is said to have destroyed an invading army of the Kamal, an Akaviri people harshly described as snow demons. If an offering of frost salts is made at the shrine, the celebrant who made the offering will receive a blessing from Almalexia, getting a temporary boon to their martial abilities. The offering to the shrine of Almalexia's Fury is quite straightforward and simple. Frost salts are regularly stocked by local alchemists and purchased at a reasonable price. Many other temple shrines are likewise minor endeavors to receive their blessing. On Vardenfell in the fields of Kumu lies the Shrine of Humility. It is here that Vivek aided a poor farmer in harvesting his mucksponge crop after his packguar died. The appropriate offering for this shrine is nothing more than a humble piece of mucksponge, which grows in abundance in the immediate area. The shrine is also located in a fairly docile area, along a well-traveled road with minimal exposure to dangerous brigands or rabid animals. For every shrine that is easy and accessible, there's two that are, to put it lightly, straight up dangerous. The pilgrimages to these shrines and the acquisition of the proper offering is designed to test the faith and fortitude of those seeking its blessing. The temple asks of its prospective priests to perform a number of pilgrimages before they can be initiated. As you rise through the ranks of the temple, you'll also be periodically commanded by your superiors to perform more extreme pilgrimages, further proof of your commitment to the living gods. One of the more treacherous pilgrimages I've heard of is that which leads to the Shrine of Courtesy, located in the canals below the palace in Vivek City. The acts undertaken to receive this shrine's blessing is a mix of two deeds performed by Vivek. During an Akaviri invasion in Second Era 572, Vivek taught the Dunmer to breathe underwater for a day so Morrowind could be flooded, destroying the invaders. Pilgrims must effectively drown themselves in the waters beneath the shrine, keeping faith that Lord Vivek will save them. Once resuscitated from near death, access to the shrine itself is now clear, but an additional act of courtesy must be performed for its blessing. The celebrant must offer a silver longsword to a Jermora that eternally stands guard over the shrine. This symbolizes a duel between Vivek and a Jermora champion of Mehrunes Dagon. Vivek, noticing the enemy without a weapon, offered his own silver longsword to the Jermora, seeing great dishonor in fighting an unarmed foe. Mehrunes Dagon, humbled by this act of chivalry, henceforth made an eternal detente with Vivek and the followers of the Tribunal Temple. Although Vivek and Mehrunes Dagon would in theory remain enemies, a mutual respect for each other would leave the Dunmer people in relative peace from Dagon's schemes. And did I mention the very route to this shrine is in itself a puzzle? Pilgrims headed to the Shrine of Courtesy are recommended to bring teleportation scrolls with them into the puzzle canals, in case they get hopelessly lost. It would seem I've been tricked into a sewer again with this one. There are dozens of shrines throughout Morrowind, and it would take me quite a long time to go over them all. Maybe I will someday. But to be honest, I've not even been able to compile a complete list of these shrines. My Imperial ass isn't yet brave enough to travel too far from Imperial and Hlalu territory. Those are people I understand. They speak the language of commerce in a way the rest of the province does not. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to travel far to the south to the Dresslands, but that time hasn't come yet. Speaking of traveling, I ought to bring up the most famous pilgrimage of the Dunmer faith, the pilgrimage of Veloth's Path. Veloth's Path marks the route that Saint Veloth is believed to have taken when traveling across Morrowind to the city of Necrom. Many important cities exist along this route, such as Kraganmore, Almasthir, and Almalexia, eventually terminating in Necrom. The path in most places is well maintained and guarded, making it one of the most traveled routes in the province. As a result, this road holds perhaps a greater significance as a vital trade route, with many arterial roads to other settlements coming off of this major east-west route. Merchants from all over the Empire travel overland to sell and buy wares in Morrowind's greatest cities. Along Velot's path, you'll find the occasional gourd harp. This instrument is not meant to be played by people, but by the wind, a breeze bringing a subtle resonance. It is believed that these sounds help guide lost spirits to Necrom, where they can finally rest. Also, a common practice for poor Dunmer is to leave the bones of their deceased loved ones at these harps, in the hopes that a generous pilgrim will carry them on to be interned in the catacombs under Necrom. To be honest, I find this to be one of the most charming of all Dunmer traditions I've come across. I've made a similar comment regarding Argonian slavery, but I assure you it was merely a joke and I was under the influence of an embarrassing amount of Mazte. Speaking of things you say too much about when drinking, it's time to talk about politics. More specifically, how the temple pertains to politics of Morrowind's great houses and imperial rule. Despite what a map of an imperial library may show you, the Ruby Throne does not exercise direct control over Morrowind. In practice, Morrowind is more akin to a protectorate or satrapy. Under the leadership of the Tribunal, in particular Lord Vivek, the forces of Emperor Tiber Septim were unable to inflict a decisive military defeat on the Dunmer, as they had elsewhere in Tamriel. However, despite the effectiveness of Dunmer resistance, it was nonetheless clear that the power of the Empire was superior, and over time would prevail with great cost. To avoid a timeline in which the war was fought to bitter annihilation, Tiber Septim and Vivek instead agreed to a negotiated peace, signing the Treaty of the Armistice, ending hostilities at the closing of the Second Era. Do not be deceived by the framing of this peace as a mutual agreement. Vivek and the Dunmer were very much compelled by their slowly declining fortunes of the war. The armistice following a great imperial victory in which the legions sacked the Dunmer capital of Mournhold. Morrowind would become a highly autonomous province of the Empire. In return, Vivek would turn over many of the resources, land, and judiciary rights of the Dunmer over to the Empire. He would also turn over the Numidium, the Dunmer superweapon that Inderal Nerevar once sought to destroy. Resulting from the terms of the armistice, Morrowind is effectively under a condominium of imperial and temple rule, a power-sharing agreement in which the great houses pay vassalage to both sides. The temple has varying degrees of political power over certain areas of the province. The temple, of course, controls a fair share of land directly, cities we know already, Vivek, Almasthir, and Necrom. In imperial cities like Old Ebonheart, there's often not even a tribunal priest, let alone an actual temple building. There may be some political representatives of the temple, but these are serving more as ambassadors to imperial authorities rather than acting as religious leaders to any local Dunmer. The great houses as well see a spectrum of temple influence. In Hlalu territory, tribunal worship is very much in a declined state versus what it once was before the Empire. The Hlalu, for better or worse, are considered the most agreeable to imperial rule. So agreeable, in fact, that many non-Dunmer have risen to high positions of leadership in the house. The Hlalu counselor for their holdings on Vardenfell is an imperial noble by the name of Crassius Curio. Even some full-blooded Dunmer nobles of the Hlalu have taken drastic steps in the direction towards imperialization. Evil Hlaren, the lord of the eponymous town of Hlarenhul, is a follower of the imperial cult religion. Where local Dunmer nobles in traditional Dunmer settlements shower the Tribunal Temple in donations and favor, in Hlarenhul, that patronage is instead given to the Chapel of Dibella. Inside the chapel, you'll find a cosmopolitan group of imperial faithful, practicing the religion of the emperor and drafting works of art in the Cyrodiilic style. Politically speaking, the temple has little influence here. It is rumored that Ivo Hlaren employs warriors of the local Fighters Guild chapter to ensure no temple ordinators or officials set foot in his town. While Hlarenhul is certainly an interesting example, it is an extreme example of Hlalu relationship to the temple. The majority of Hlalu nobles still profess the tribunal faith, but as we've come to see, are more than willing to forget its tenets for imperial gold. Nobles of the Hlalu and some of the other houses are more than willing to play the empire and temple against each other to enrich themselves. The Tribunal Temple itself is also in the business of playing sides against each other. In theory, the Tribunal are the de jure rulers of Morrowind, and in turn, they give their fealty to the Emperor. But that does not mean the great houses are passive vassals in this awkward feudal agreement. The nobles of these great houses are always looking for advantage on one another, and the temple often is in the position to play peacekeeper or pick favorites. The city of Almasthir lies at a crossroads between two philosophies of Morrowind society. On the west bank of the Thur River, the lands of the Hlalu, ever the cooperative with the imperial yoke. On the east lies the Induril, the last true followers of the Dunmer old ways. Even deep in Induril territory, imperial law is technically august over local law, but as long as the legions stay in their forts, real power will remain exercised by Induril nobles, ever devout followers of the Tribunal. During the war against the Empire, the Induril were the most opposed to the signing of the armistice, preferring death to dishonor if they must. Alas, their devotion to Vivec means they too would yield and reluctantly accept imperial hegemony. Induril governance even retains many features of the old ways. Instead of fully adopting the imperial district system that subdivides Morrowind on imperial maps, the Induril still rule through a chapel system. A very rudimentary but sound method, the chapelry system divides Induril territory, especially rural areas, by how close they are to a particular chapel. Chapel, of course, being tied to the temple religion. Chapels are a mix of religious and state function, being the residence of the local noble and priest alike. Villages are then bound to their local chapels, the people and their local leaders being subjects of a chapel. As time marches on, though, it is very evident this system is in decline. Many Induril nobles paying less homage to a system that puts their status equal or below that of the clergy, instead focusing on building manors and strongholds independent of temple authority. Still, in spite of all this, Induril remain the most devout of the Dunmer in their adherence to the Tribunal. In being some of the staunchest followers of the Tribunal, the faculty of the temple itself is disproportionately composed of Induril Dunmer. The orders of the Ordinators, for example, are very much under the influence of the Induril. If you've seen an Ordinator on the streets of Almastir or Vivec City, chances are they're an Induril Dark Elf. With the Induril being so intertwined with the temple, it can be safely assumed that at least this great house probably has the complete trust of temple authorities. Or maybe it's the Induril that are pulling the strings. Up to you, really. But I'd wager the tribunes that can beat Daedra in duels and wipe out Akaviri armies with the wave of a hand are the true lords over some old Dunmer nobles still seething over how they could have possibly been bested by the forces of men. The Dunmer of Morrowind are renowned, known over, for the intricacies of their civilization. Thousands of years of societal growth as the Chimer, then Dunmer, have led to great cities, works of art, sophisticated treatises, advances in magicka, etc. But many parts of Morrowind remain what some would consider wild or untamed. The ashlands, forests, swamps, and badlands in many corners of the province mostly untouched by the winds of time. It is not just the plants and wildlife that are untamed, but the people as well. These nomadic tribes living in the ways their ancestors always have are the Ashlanders. There was once a time where virtually all the Chimer lived in ways such as this. However, as the establishment of the Tribunal led likewise to the increased establishment of cities, the Ashlanders kept to their old ways. You see, the Ashlanders do not revere the Tribunal as settled Dunmer do. They do not view them as the anticipations of the good Daedra, and instead continue to worship the good Daedra directly, as Veloth did. We're about to get into some real heresy hours. I mentioned in my retelling of the Battle of Red Mountain that there are numerous accounts of the battle differing from the narrative given by the Tribunal Temple. Most of these accounts come from other peoples present at the time, like the Nords, who recorded their own independent history. But there is a competing narrative from within the Dunmer that continues to be taught to the unreformed Ashlanders of Morrowind. The greatest of Induril Nerevar's shield companions who followed him to battle was the great warrior Alandro Sul. According to legend, he defeated the Nord Ash King Wulfharth in single combat, but was blinded in turn. He was the first to report the death of Nerevar to Almsivi and the Chimer people, carrying Nerevar down from Red Mountain on his shield. Alandro Sul's pronouncement of Nerevar's fate differs according to the Ashlander account. In Ashlander oral tradition, purportedly told originally by Alandro Sul, Almsivi banished Vorin Dagoth and murdered Nerevar themselves. Nerevar wanted to destroy Numidium and prevent anyone from wielding the power of the Heart of Lorkhan. Upon discovering this, the Tribunal betrayed Nerevar, for they desired to wield this power themselves. Nerevar's cause had been betrayed, and by proxy, the good Daedra had been betrayed. Alandro Sul, blinded and maligned, found few who would listen to his account. Very little is known about Alandro Sul outside of official temple narratives. The scant alternative Ashlander accounts of his exploits make it hard to discern fact from mythology. Was he delusioned, as the Ashlanders say, or perhaps an insert of the Ashlanders in defiance of those who would poach their herds and drive them off their lands? Hard to say, a question I'm not equipped to answer. But what I can tell you is the temple works very hard to control interactions of Dunmer and Outlanders alike with the Ashlanders. Treating with the Ashlanders usually requires approval from temple authorities for those trying to keep everything above board. Many Ashlanders that leave their traditional lives behind to find new life among the settled Dunmer are often monitored and held under scrutiny by ever-watchful temple acolytes. Despite this mutual suspicion, it is clear the temple is not openly hostile or genocidal in any way towards the Ashlanders. In the opinion of many, the Ashlanders are merely savages who have been led astray by their tribal elders and must merely experience the wisdom of the tribunal to turn away from heresy. That leads us to the Shinathi tribes of southwest Morrowind. At first glance, the Shinathi appear as any other Ashlander tribe, but on closer investigation, you'll find the hand of the tribunal does in fact reach out to touch the nomadic tribes. The Shinathi are in fact followers of the tribunal faith, true as any Dunmer in Necrom or Balmora. The Shinathi live in the Shipal Shin region of Morrowind, Badlands to the west of the Halalu city of Narcissus. The Shinathi trace their lineage from nomadic Khans originally from central Morrowind that once made war with Indral Nerevar and were eventually driven off by the Great Houses. Not a singular entity, the Shinathi are in fact made up of several tribes with a tendency to be red-haired. Over time, the Shinathi and the Halalu became close friends, and priests were given permission to preach in Shinathi lands, gradually converting them to the temple faith. In the heart of Shinathi territory, in the camp of the Hunza tribe, lies the Shrine of Conviction, which commemorates the conversion of the Shinathi. The inscription on the shrine reads, "Here we commemorate the priests of the Tribunal Temple who met with the gathered Shinathi tribespeople and, through conversation and exchange of gifts, revealed to them the truth of Alm Sivi." The inscription is the key to how the Shinathi came to befriend the Hlalu and convert to their faith. As we know, the Hlalu love a good bargain, and the Shinathi were able to offer them that. The Shinathi have a unique product they produce from the native plants from nearby Badlands, an alcohol called shakal. You'd think since it comes from a nomadic peoples used to hard living that the drink would be bitter. It's actually quite smooth, unlike many other Dunmer brews. The Shinathi do seem to take their newfound temple faith quite seriously. Tribal camps have a resident priest, who in most cases is a close confidant of the Sahar Khan, the tribal leader. They do, however, retain some eccentricities of their old ways. Many of the Shinathi still practice old nomadic rituals or allow apostates to return to the tribe. A work in progress for the temple, I suppose. The story of the Tribunal Temple of Morrowind truly is a fascinating one. And really, I could go on for far longer about its history and practices. Alas, I'm getting long-winded enough as it is with what I've covered so far. I'll save the rest for another time. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I appreciate all the support I've received making these videos. If you haven't already, consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment. If you want to support my work even more, check out the Patreon. A huge thank you to the Curate level patron Brandy Hutzel and all the acolytes that voted for this video to be made in a Patreon poll. Talk to you all soon in the next one.